Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we piss off a lot of anti-Israel people by taking a look at my DNA. Let's get started. If you are an influencer online, especially a Jewish one who's pro-Israel, guaranteed by now you've had a comment or two in one of your posts saying, "Show us your DNA." This is a regular occurrence for these people online who are convinced that the DNA will prove everything, or in their case, hoping it disproves everything, like we're really a bunch of white Europeans with no connection to the land whatsoever. I can't tell you how many times I've received this online. I know some of the other influencers online have actually went and got their DNA tested specifically for this issue. Not that it makes much of a difference, because even with those results, these trolls don't believe it anyway. I've even heard the case that these DNA companies are apparently, quote, run by the Jews. So therefore, they ask us for a DNA test and then don't trust the results. Maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist here, but it kind of feels like the answer doesn't really matter, and they already have their mind made up despite the facts. But that's crazy talk. On some of our previous episodes, we've talked a little bit about the issue of who belongs in the land, who's indigenous, and we typically will avoid the whole DNA talk. We have talked a little bit about DNA in a few of our episodes, but in this episode, I really want to dive deep into DNA and our DNA as Jewish people. For the record, this very bad talking point stems from the idea that the Jewish people today are not related to the Jewish people of the Torah, of the land. They're a bunch of, quote, white European colonizers. My personal theory on this issue is the fact that for so long the Arabs, the so-called Palestinians, tried desperately to suggest that the Jewish people don't belong in Israel. The biggest problem they have with this lie that they've been telling is the fact that most people with half a brain, especially our Christian friends and even the Muslims themselves, know that their book says that the Jews were in the land. Whether it's the Quran that says the children of Israel, meaning the Jews, were given the land of Israel, or the Christians who have read the entire Old Testament and the New Testament that says that Jesus himself lived in Judea. So it's getting a little bit more difficult for people with half a brain to believe the idea that Jews don't come from the land of Israel or Judea. They did. So they had to change their talking point a little bit, because now that everybody knows the Jews did come from Judea, how do we explain why the Jews of today don't belong in the land of Israel, and it really is Palestinian land? And this is where the Khazari theory comes in. And for those of you who haven't heard our previous podcasts where we touched on this, the Khazar theory comes from the 950s or 960s, when a Khazar correspondence was found, where supposedly a letter was sent in correspondence with the Khazars, where a Jewish man from Spain had heard about this supposed group of Khazars that were converting to Judaism and wanted to be in touch. So supposedly the letter that returned to this person in Spain contained the story of the Khazars and how they converted. However, scholars will show that there is a major flaw in this theory. First of all, the fact that the letter has no authenticity whatsoever. We don't even know if it was real. And if the letter itself was real, which is held by some people who study linguistics to make sure it's legitimate, doesn't necessarily mean the person who wrote it was actually telling the truth. Some scholars suggest that it is possible that the person who was being sent to go bring a letter to the Khazars didn't actually make it to the kingdom of the Khazars, and simply wrote back a letter just on his own, telling this story that he simply made up. And now, with the age of DNA, we have debunked this claim entirely, because the DNA has proved that Ashkenazi Jews have literally no genetic connection to the area of the Khazars. The Khazari people, who were Turkish living in the Caucasus Mountains, have no similarities to Ashkenazi Jews. So if you assume that every single Ashkenazi Jew of today came from the Khazars, you'd expect them to possibly have the same DNA markers as the Khazars. They have no connection to anybody from that region. Ironically, most Jewish people don't have DNA that matches anybody in Europe. And what DNA tests have proved is that the Jewish people from Europe are connected to the Jewish people from all over the world. It is pretty clear from the DNA evidence that the Jewish people are unique and do not come from Europe, do not come from Saudi Arabia, do not come from Spain. They all share DNA with one another, and they are not like the people they lived amongst for so many years. But the purpose of this Khazar theory was to try and disconnect the Jewish people from their land. And it was kind of a perfect idea until DNA destroyed it. Just suggest that the people who live in Israel today are not connected to the biblical Jews, because everybody agrees now begrudgingly that the biblical Jews did live there, but the people today aren't those people. Let's leave aside the fact that this doesn't include the Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, or the Jews who literally never left the land ever. They were continuous for 3,000 years. These wouldn't have been Khazar converts, people who never went to Europe. And this gets us to my specific DNA. As what would be considered an Ashkenazi Jew and a Levite, I have somewhat special DNA, not to toot my own horn. But my DNA comes from a very specific family. There have been multiple studies about the Kohanim gene. These are the people who stem from Aaron, the brother of Moses himself. Both Moses and Aaron were Levites from the tribe of Levi. So, unlike other cultures and groups, let's say Italian or Portuguese, you could say where you're from generally speaking. It comes from a region. But when it comes to Jewish people, especially like the Levites and the Kohanim, this is a literal family. And so when you test one Levite on one side of the earth to another Levite in another side of the earth, they actually have a DNA connection. And it's been proven. As many of my listeners might be aware of, the Levites played a very significant role in Israel. They worked in the temple. They were the priests. And sadly, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, they shipped a lot of Jewish people off to Rome as slaves. According to some scholars, the Roman Emperor Titus brought 8,000 Jewish captives from Judea to Italy, where they lived in Apulia in southern Italy. And this eventually led to them spreading out across the Italian peninsula until the time of the Byzantines, when Rome fell and when Constantinople became the center of the Roman Empire. The Jews eventually migrated north. Eventually they got their freedom. They wanted to get out of the area that they were oppressed, and they moved into northern Italy and then eventually the Rhineland of Germany. And this is where the Ashkenazi Jews get their name from. Ashkenaz means Germany. According to the Bible, Ashkenaz, a person, lived in the area of Germany, and therefore the Jews from that area referred to themselves as Ashkenazi Jews in the area of Ashkenaz. Unfortunately, as many of you probably know, many Jews were spread all over Europe as they were kicked out from one country to another. Different countries removed them, called them back, and they were just looking for freedom and safety and security, which was kind of hard to find in Europe. So my family very likely came through Rome. They were taken as slaves by the Romans. They made their way north to Europe, and that's where my family ended up. And I guess thanks to the fact that there were so many rules against Jews all over Europe, we didn't really integrate with the larger community. Often we were kept in ghettos, or we self-ghettoized ourselves in order to maintain our culture and maintain our faith. So we didn't integrate genetically that much with other people. I mean, it did happen from time to time, but very rare. So this allows us to paint a much better picture of our DNA than, unfortunately for some, who get DNA tests with 5% from here and 10% from here. It is actually surprisingly common for Jewish people when they get DNA tests to be 99.9% Ashkenazi Jew, or 100% from the Levant as a Mizrahi Jew. That's how I am able to know that I have a very specific haplogroup, R1A1, known as the Ashkenazi Levites. These are people all over the world who have the same DNA, and we can trace our lineage back over 1,000 years ago to a single person. And according to a 2017 paper specifically on R1A-Y2619, Ashkenazi Levites, the paper found that the Ashkenazi Levite cluster originates from the Middle East to around 3,143 years ago. And they have found matches for our DNA in Iran. The Levites from Iran are my cousins. My Levite cousins who were kicked out of the land 650 years before my family were kicked out by the Romans. The irony in the fact that this completely debunks all of these false claims about Jews not coming from the land, no matter if we're from Iran or Iraq or Ashkenaz. So, needless to say, this whole Khazar theory, or these idiots online demanding to see my DNA, and then when you tell them what your DNA test says, they get very much triggered. The irony of asking for proof, and then I give you that proof that tells you exactly what I've been saying. All of a sudden you disappear or block us or say, show me the evidence. Or even worse, that all DNA companies are run by Jews and that's why they lie. It is a little bit pathetic and very entertaining to watch them demand a DNA test only to find out that it proves us right. They can't really handle that. But it's all based on these lies about how the Jews aren't indigenous to the land and the fact that supposedly, according to these people, the Palestinian Arabs are indigenous to the land. We've talked a little bit in the past about the historical record, the census data, all the things that show that Arab immigrants came to this land, how an Arab immigrant from Egypt or Saudi Arabia could be, quote, indigenous to the land when they are documented as traveling there is beyond me. But the funny thing is that they will pull out some DNA that suggests that Palestinian Arabs are in fact indigenous, that they do have ties to that land. And they're not wrong. They're just incredibly selective. What history has shown us, whether it's through documentation or the fact that the Middle East and North Africa all suffered under the same colonization as Israel, is that the Arab conquest took over. When they took over the land, they gave the Jews the choice. Either convert, die, or leave. Some Jewish people did choose to leave. Others chose to live under the dhimmi system where they had to pay back-breaking humiliation tax. And others did in fact convert. It was much easier. You wouldn't have to pay the jizya, the tax anymore. As a Muslim, you would be able to live with a much lower tax. So many people did convert. It was kind of the purpose of the jizya. And some of these Jews who converted to Islam, some of which might have actually converted to Christianity first and then to Islam, because many Jews did that as well during the time the Christians ran the area. These people today are considered to be Palestinians, either Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Muslim. And because some of these people were in fact Jews who converted, many of which don't realize they were Jews, do have DNA that ties them to the land. Because if you're Jewish, you belong in the land. You came from Judea. So when people like to claim that the Palestinian Arabs are indigenous, what they'll do is they'll make sure to test a few people, a small amount, which are actually Judeans who converted, and then they'll use their DNA to prove that all Palestinians are apparently from Judea, or Palestine as they like to call it. The other slight challenge when we talk about Arabs and DNA is the fact that Jewish people in the Mizrahi group were exiled to places like Babylon or Iraq, Persia or Iran, places like Yemen where there were huge groups of Jews who lived in and around the Arabs. And there is no question in the history books, especially the Quran, of how the Arabs treated the Jews. Muhammad decided to massacre Jews in places like Khaybar and take all of their women and children, take them as slaves and brides. According to the Quran, Muhammad himself married a Jewish woman right after he murdered her husband and her brother and took her as a slave. So it is possible that there are some Arabs that came from Saudi Arabia that did have some Jewish DNA. This could show up because a Jewish person was taken from their Jewish family, they were forced into being a wife of an Arab, and therefore they might have some Jewish DNA, which would then possibly show up on a DNA test. But just because an Arab from Saudi Arabia has a tiny bit of Levantine DNA doesn't really make them indigenous. It doesn't make an Arab indigenous to Judea. But this is somewhat of a rare situation. It doesn't happen too frequently. Because the irony of this whole DNA argument, which I often bring up to these trolls, is if the Palestinian Arabs were actually indigenous to the land, the ones that migrated there that are not converted Jews, why is it that they keep having to go to DNA testing companies and demand to be recognized as Palestinian Arabs? There is currently a Change.org petition by Palestinian Arabs and their supporters in order to try and force the DNA companies to recognize a Palestinian DNA, something that literally doesn't exist because the DNA companies very clearly said that Palestine wasn't a place. It was simply a territory for a short amount of time. Someone cannot have a DNA marker from a territory that only existed for 20 years. These supposed Palestinian Arabs are getting a little bit pissed off getting their results back saying they're from Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iraq when they think they're quote-unquote Palestinians. So they decided to petition the DNA companies to somehow find a way to call them Palestinians, despite the DNA proving otherwise. If the Palestinian Arabs were actually indigenous to the land, they probably wouldn't need that, much like the Judeans, who have had testing done on their DNA to prove exactly what we already knew, what our book says, that we are all part of one family, that we all share the same DNA no matter where we were, and it all stems back to the land of Judea. In the end, the funniest part of this talking point, that the Jewish people have no DNA connection and that we should all go get DNA tests, is actually debunked many times over. The fact that they now try and suggest that Jews don't actually have DNA tests because it's illegal in Israel is a complete fiction. It's simply restricted like it is in many other places around the world. You're not allowed to use the results against someone for employment or for paternity. But meanwhile, these people online are still using this completely debunked talking point because, as always, facts don't really matter to them. No matter how much proof you can show them, archaeologically, DNA, linguistically, that we belong and we come from Judea, it really doesn't matter. They don't want it to be true, so they choose not to believe it. But something that we as Jewish people can do is look at our DNA and be proud. Be proud that the book that you and many other people read, known as the Torah, is your family's story. I have always said to myself how interesting it is that if you're the royal family in, let's say, England, that the entire country of England learns about your family's history as their history, and how amazing and awe-inspiring that would be to know that everybody studies your specific family. Meanwhile, little did I realize until somewhat recently, that everybody in the world who follows the Old Testament or the Torah, Jews and Christians, read our family story. They read about our ancestors, people who have DNA ties to us. And even if they don't realize it, by following this book, whether it's the Christian Old Testament, the Quran, or even the Jewish Torah, these people are following our family story and hoping for our family success. And that is something that is so incredible, and it's buried deep down in our DNA. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.